Hi, hello, welcome back. My name is Devaraj and welcome back to this series on bioenergetics and specifically Reichian characterology. This week we're going to continue, I've got my little notes here. This week we're going to continue looking at the rigid personality type, which generally is categorized into or split down, broken down into 4 or 5 different types of personality. Last week we looked at number 1, the phallic narcissist, classic male stereotype. And we looked at many different aspects of a phallic narcissist. And this week we're going to look at more a feminine stereotype, usually called the hysterical or hysteric. Before I get into this in detail, just to mention with Reichian characterology, this is something that was developed nearly 100 years ago by Wilhelm Reich. And what's actually happened and it achieved prominence really with the work of Alexander Lowen in particular in the 50s and 60s and 70s through into the 80s and 90s. But now that we reach, 2020, essentially it's largely disappeared from view, and it's kind of crazy in a sense. And it's kind of instructive to me, the myth of moving forwards, the myth of moving forwards. Because it's not that our culture hasn't moved forwards, in many ways it has, but also in terms of psychology and understanding, some areas have actually become more submerged from view. Yes, we've developed a lot more, mind-based cognitive therapies, and that's all great. There's much more widespread understanding of meditation, of the body, of emotional expression. These kind of things start to come in. But when you look at work as deep as Reichian characterology, first emerging with Reich's book in 1933, it's clear to me that a lot of people working in the trauma scene actually have very little understanding of it. And it's kind of a shame. It's a shame, because working with trauma at a more cognitive level is fine, and there's nothing wrong with that. But if you don't understand this stuff, then, put it another way, if you do understand this stuff, then your capacity to serve and sort out your clients is going to be vastly deepened. So it's quite instructive to me how, this ego we have always thinks we're much more advanced and we're moving on and blah, blah, blah. But actually quite a lot of very powerful, good stuff has been submerged from view. And Reichian characterology is a classic example of that. So if you are watching this and you are interested in trauma, it's really worth studying. What makes it, of course, a little bit tricky to study is there's not so many good books. Those that there are tend to be written many, many decades ago using a lot of old psychiatric language from the Freudian era, much of which has kind of fallen out of use even in mainstream psychology. And likewise, because it's so based around actual trauma, and that's so based around early childhood, and child rearing practices have changed quite considerably since the 20s and 30s when this work was originally written. It has changed a bit. But nevertheless, there's a lot of useful material in there. As I've said in the intro to other talks in this series, watch out for the trap of falling too much into which one am I, and look more, it's more useful generally, especially these days, to look how much of this character do I have in my personality. Even if you're a guy watching this, you may find aspects of a hysteric female in there. So having had this preamble, let's go through again. Once again, we'll have a little bit of an introduction. We'll look at some of the symptoms of the hysterical, type 2 rigid. A bit of a psychology and childhood stuff, physicality, and treatment. How do you help people like this move forwards, let go of some of this, the character that's been structured in their body, in their personality at a deep level. So let's review the introduction. So yes, these characters are predominantly women, predominantly female, and something that's interesting to note with these rigid characters is that the rigid subtypes, contrasting them to the orals or the endurers, also known as the masochists, is that the male, placed in the same environment to grow up, the male tends to develop differently from the female. And this is because the point with orals that's not so significant or noticed. With masochists, with endurers, it's not so significant or noticed, and that's because the trauma tends to go in much earlier. We're talking first 15 months. What's classically called the oral stage in child psychology, derived from Freud. And with these guys, most of the rigids, they may have some oral or masochist traits, but the trauma, the main underlying trauma which creates this personality stereotype or this aspect of the personality is going in later on. It's going in more age 3, 4, 5 as the genital phase kicks in, basically, if you're into early child psychology. When kids become more interested in their genitals and when energy starts to develop there and in the head. Okay. Dum, 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 dum. So, you've got quite a separation between male and female. And this is also interesting when we consider how much at the minute in today's culture, it being 2020, many people are looking at gender fluidity and trying to, from a mental level, as I see it, resolve the differences between the genders. When you study child psychology and when you study characterology and this kind of thing, it shows that there may be significant differences, partly socio-cultural, but also partly genetic, which are important in our overall psychological makeup. So, hysteria and hysterical characters, this is quite an interesting term, really. In fact, it was the presence of hysteria, or this diagnosis of finding women in particular who were hysterical, that in many ways, triggered modern psychoanalysis back in the 1850s, 1860s, these kind of rather rigid males who were psychoanalysts or neurologists at the time, who were working with people on a mental health level, were fascinated by hysterical females. And it was because of that, which says quite a bit about them, basically, and their difficulties to be emotionally fluid. But certainly, historically, hysteria has been very, very interesting. And it was the presence of hysteria that originally spurred Freud, Charcot, and these kind of guys back in the 19th century to get into, to create psychoanalysis, essentially. The term hysteric was, in fact, originally coined by Reich for this overall category of personality types. Later on, it became termed rigid, and sometimes it's now been returned perfectionist or obsessional, which I don't think is very good. I think rigid is better, personally. And also to mention, before we get into it, in Freudian times, back in the Victorian era, the hysteric woman was more of a kind of sleeping beauty type, they would fantasize about sexual things and my prince coming and this kind of thing, but they didn't really act out sexually. But of course, post-1960s and widespread sexual liberation for women, rigid women of this type are more likely to be sexually active, but on a kind of heart or love level, in deep intimacy level. That is where the fear really kicks in. We'll look at that a little bit more as we go along. Symptoms, okay. Yes, predominantly female. In their attitude and general bearing, they tend to be proud. The women tend to be proud. They tend to be determined, quite determined. They're prone to drama-creating behaviour and hysterical outbursts. They tend to like intrigue. They like to gossip. They may recount their life rather like it's a soap opera, in hushed tones. They may regularly use alcohol or recreational drugs, really to sort of let go of tension, basically. They're usually busy with social status of other women and potential males, potential partners, and they tend to seek validation through social status. This is also a classic symptom of someone with submerged low self-esteem. They look to other people who have got apparently high status to validate themselves and make themselves feel okay about themselves, something that doesn't really work, but looks from the outside like it might. When hysteric women from this category are describing something, they tend to be very focused on the mood, on the feeling of the thing, and not so busy with the details or the kind of facts of the situation. But, despite this, their grasp on reality is good. They really understand reality, and they're also quite intuitive and generally capable of protecting themselves with intuition. They don't need so many facts and details and this kind of thing. They can feel bad situations better, well enough to protect themselves as a rule. In their kind of love life or when they're seeking partners, they tend to be quite overtly sexual or teasing. We'll talk about that a little later on. Like the phallic narcissists, another rigid subcategory that we looked at last week, they may perceive the whole world as highly sexualized. Something they may go out at times with men that they find feminine and proceed to berate them for their lack of masculinity. We'll look at what's going on there a little bit. There may be punishing behavior in this, or they may recognize that, you know, whilst they can get love from a more feminine male, and we'll be looking at some of the more feminine male archetypes in a little while, in later on down the line, they aren't sexually attracted to them or don't believe this man can fulfill them sexually. They tend to hold themselves back quite a lot in love relationships, or maybe play games a little bit to try and create intrigue, to try and create the person is kind of hooking to them addictively for, you know, for power, for control, essentially. Let's look a little bit at the psychology. Well, the drama-creating aspect of this woman's personality seems to exist to constantly release tension on a surface level. You know, there are deep wounds inside that get triggered, but before they can come to the surface, they keep on releasing. So they're having dramas left, right, and centre. You know, and generally in their behaviour and perhaps use of alcohol or recreational substances, you know, it's to let the tension off the surface. It's to constantly let the tension off the surface. They may have had a rigid parent, very likely, who really kind of laid their trip on them around ages 3 to 6. There could be trauma in that age group, around that age, in the sense of abandonment, in the sense of abuse. It may be quite likely that a parent, usually the father, was quite dismissive of any. It's quite natural for little girls around the age of 3, 4, 5, when their sexuality starts to develop a bit, they kind of get a little bit towards the dad, and the dad has to handle this situation quite carefully. And when there's been a strong rejection from the father, that can submerge a lot of shame and anger inside the infant. And they may, you know, if that happens, they may be determined never to be hurt like this again. It may create a very deep distrust of men, because the first movement towards the father is blocked. You know, it's a very powerful thing to go through. They may have had a mother who was competitive. Like phallic narcissists, they tend to distinguish or separate in their own mind quite strongly between sex and love. You know, sex is something they can go after in a certain way. Love is a different kettle of fish. Love is something that is scary and needs to be controlled a lot, or very, very slowly moved into. Sex is more something that they can go for, that excites them, that gives them a kind of adrenal rush. Fundamental belief that falling in love is very dangerous and, you know, needs to be treated with extreme care. Thus, they may come to see, you know, one type of man as being good for sex and another as being good for love. This will be very common part of their belief system. A way that they tend to attract men is a kind of teasing and submissive behaviour often. Teasing and submissive behaviour to pull the man in, in fact, phallic narcissists love this stuff, to pull them in. Basically, but it's undertaken with quite an aggressive and controlling attitude. It might look real, but it's actually taken with quite a, you know, calculating attitude to get the man in and to, you know, minimise their exposure to risk. What's absolutely standard with rigid females of this type, the hysterical type, is they have a core of very deep neediness, very deep wounded core that needs to be taken care of, but they are terrified to feel it or to show it, believing that if they do expose this neediness, it will invalidate them as a person and mean that they will never get, you know, love, they will never get sex. So they hide it and hide it away. Because of this, they can tend to move from partner to partner, and when intimacy, you know, if you start having sex regularly with one person, unless you're very, very closed and really, really controlling a lot, of course your heart starts to get a bit more involved, and this is very scary for women in this category. Likewise, phallic narcissists, you know, who've been through similar childhoods, and so essentially they will then often want to move out and be the one that leaves as well, move on to the next one, move on to the next one is quite common. You know, underneath the surface, the fear is to recontact the wound, the sense of rejection from the father. And also important to mention, as we saw with the phallic narcissist, is that, you know, women of this type are the backbone of Western society. The way the culture has gone, it's tended to churn out hysteric females. Certainly from the 30s, 40s, 50s onwards, this was the standard American woman. This was a standard American woman. Proud, wanting to have, you know, good things in life. Nothing wrong with that. But that pride is held in the jaw and the neck. And it's coming from trauma. It's coming from trauma, basically. But nevertheless, like the phallic narcissist, the culture has tended to churn these people out as because it's perceived either for intention or just the way the culture has developed, that this is how we keep maintaining ourselves to the next generation. Keep on churning out phallic narcissists and keep on churning out hysteric women for the two to couple up with each other. They don't really get super close and intimate, but they can have kids and be functional on a certain level, and they will maintain, the pride in the woman and the driving kind of corporate instinct in the man will maintain the kind of the corporate vessel as it moves forwards. Okay, let's look a little at physicality, at the body of a hysteric woman. What's distinctive is that they tend to be very rigid in the upper body, particularly around the jaw and the neck. The jaw and the neck get set. They get set with pride. This pride is held, particularly around the jaw, the masseter muscles, which run down from both sides of your lower part of your cheekbone here, down to the base of your jawbone. There's muscles here, and these tend to be quite tense in the hysteric woman. Sometimes the legs are rigid too. Upper body rigidity is high. But what's interesting is that the pelvis tends to be fairly fluid. They can move their pelvis, which gives them instinctively a kind of sexuality, an instinctive sexiness to them. They can move the pelvis. And, because of this, they're good at dancing. They can get men, generally. They can get men when they turn it on. Like the phallic narcissists, they tend to be charged strongly in the head and in the genitals. And it's a cultural thing largely, but because Western culture in particular, and to be honest, most world cultures tend to perceive being promiscuous as okay for men, but not okay for women, then in the female psyche, particularly combined with this trauma and the pride, the women compress the upper part of the body to keep a lid on the sexuality, to keep it under control, to keep it very strongly under control. And so this is a big part of their physical makeup, and of course it rigidifies their upper body. They may be like the phallic narcissists, they may suffer from quite a lot of lower back tension, a lot of feelings crammed in there, and a lot of stiffness there, even though the pelvic can be moving well. Okay, so having looked at those things, let's look about treatment moving forwards. How does someone from this background move forwards? The fastest way to move a hysteric woman basically is for them to be able to access underneath the fear, underneath the control is rage. Rage against men and rage against the father in particular. So this, if you can get someone into that rage, and you can do some body opening first, bow and arch, upper body opening. If you can get them into rage against men, this will really move them quickly. From there, they can start to feel more of the vulnerability, of a wound inside. There's a lot of pain inside from this rejection from the father. It's very, very strong. So rage is great. If you can get them into rage, it's going to move them very quickly. You could also consider quite a lot of palpation, massage exercises, myofascial release, particularly the masseter muscles, particularly around the throat and the jaw and the neck. Again, can bring a lot of feelings to the surface, anger or sadness. Remember, the key to understanding the hysteric woman is that there is a lot of emotion just below the surface. You don't have to dig for it like you would more with the oral or the endurer. It's just there beneath the surface. And like the phallic narcissist, of course, they don't tend to go for therapy quite so often. They may get intrigued or their lives may get fucked up and they go for it, but they tend to hold, because they've got this pride in the jaw, and this general demeanor of pride, going to therapy is not seen as a good thing to do, something which is changing a little bit and makes it easier for people from this kind of background and phallic narcissists as well to go to therapy and not feel that this means somewhere that they're not good enough or something like this, something they're very afraid of feeling. So that's really covering it. Also leg exercises can be useful to get more grounding in there. And of course, treatment generally, whilst it was more, when this diagnostic tool and treatment tool, Reichian characterology, was created, it was created as a kind of adjunct or as supplement to psychoanalysis. So patients going for therapy in this school would be given some psychoanalysis, looking at the childhood, looking at the posture, working out which category they're in, and then giving them specific exercises to do. And I've talked a little bit about that stuff here. But of course, with any of these stereotypes, grounding is good. Working with the ankles, legs, hips, pelvis and belly is good. You know, starting to clear out lower back tension is good. Starting to clear out shoulder tension is good. Getting the throat more open so they can express, getting the heart more open so they can feel, and getting the belly more open so they're more in their power. All of these things are good. So, you know, Reichian characterology is a very, very useful thing. But of course, for treatment, certainly, if you come to the work I'm doing, then it's going to be... Shouldn't have eaten those peanuts just now. Sorry about that. But if you come to the kind of work I'm doing, then, you know, it's quite a broad spectrum approach, because I find that is valid. Nevertheless, it can be very, very useful when you're working with clients to be able to see, you know, okay, which kind of group are they in? One of the key things to mention, you know, I should have really put it at the beginning, towards understanding trauma, you know, a very, very powerful point about trauma, which comes out when you study Reichian characterology, is the importance of the age. If the ego has developed into the genital phase, then it tends to create people who fight, either internally or but their ego is active. And when the trauma comes in earlier, in the first year, 15 months of life, then you create more orals or endurers. People who have kind of either living in a state of complete deprivation and neediness, the oral in their inner world, or in a state of kind of, you know, the muscle system in the endurer literally develops to keep the emotions in, to keep all the emotions in. So this is something you can really take away from this series. But I've, studying again this material, it's something that's very clear to me. When the trauma comes in much earlier, before the ego is really kicked in, age about 1.5 or 2, you know, and started to develop, those people are very different, or the oral or endurer aspect of the psyche is very, very different. It is either surrendered heavily and the muscles are now holding everything in, or it's really just lifeless with energy and has kind of given up and is just trying to find something to suck onto, literally, which is the body position even of the oral. So these rigids are all ego characters. They've got egos, they grasp reality, they know what the world is like, and they've developed their own mechanisms to cope with life and to try and get their needs met. Okay. So I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. I'll be continuing along with this series, certainly we'll look at the passive feminine male, and we'll probably look at the masculine aggressive female. Two slightly passive feminine males are on the rise these days, so we'll definitely look at that one. We'll look at the aggressives, and then we'll move on to some of the other character types, which are a little more extreme in some ways. Psychopath, sociopath, and schizoid types. Okay, I hope you've enjoyed this series. Remember, if you are interested in Reichian characterology and bioenergetics in general, then do check out Bioenergetics for Journey. It's a 52-week course that you can do in your leisure. Take as long as you want with it from your room. There's a lot of theoretical modules, and we cover a lot deeper Reichian characterology, and also every week we're working with the body and understanding and releasing the past. Okay, that's it from me. Feel free to like and subscribe and all that kind of stuff. And I will see you again next week for more in this series. Maybe something else before then. Bye for now.